Hello and welcome to lecture number 7 of Persecution and Anthropology of Witch Hunts. This week the lecture is entitled Witch Hunts, Salem and McCarthy. I'm your lecturer, Dr Nick Herriman, anthropologist at Trobe University. In the previous lecture I provided an overview of the Great Witch Hunt in Europe. This week I will focus on the Salem witch trials and McCarthyism. By doing this, I hope to provide a clearer sense of what we might call a witch hunt. The Salem witch trials took place in 1692-1693. They occurred in one of the North American colonies, which, a century later, would achieve independence and unite as the USA. The trials themselves were prosecutions of suspected witches, taking place in a court in Salem town, about 22 miles or 35 kilometres north of Boston. The witches initially were taken from nearby Salem village. Eventually, the trials incorporated around 150 suspects from more than 24 villages and towns. As a result, 28 were convicted of witchcraft, with 19 hanged and 1 pressed to death during trial. The basic outline of events is that around 1691, dabbling in magic had become the fashion among young people in New England. Young girls in Salem village began to have frightening visions and fits. At first, 2 girls were affected, Abigail Williams, aged 11, and Betty Paris, aged 9, the daughter of a reverend named Samuel Paris. The afflictions, quotes, came to affect about 7 or 8 other girls as well, ranging in age from 12 to 19. Under questioning, the girls named 3 women as their tormentors: Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and Tituba, a slave in the Paris' household. In other words, they identified these people as witches. On February 29, 1692, warrants were sent out. 2 members of the provincial legislature too examined the women. 2 of the women denied that they were witches, but Tituba, the slave, confessed. The convulsions continued, so more arrests of witches followed, and from other villages and towns as well. Trials began, and some of the accused were condemned to death. After 19 hangings, the affair was brought to an end, largely by questioning of the legal process, particularly regarding the admissibility of evidence. The Salem witch trials stand out in 2 ways. First, they occurred in 1692-1693, when the worst of the witch hunting of the Great Witch Hunt had subsided in Western Europe. Second, the witch trials occurred amongst Europeans in the New World, that is, in the Americas, in particular the American colony, which was, during the events, being renamed as the province of Massachusetts Bay. The trials themselves were preceded by smaller outbreaks. Boyer and Nissenbaum, in their classic academic history of the events, note that prior to the Salem outbreak, witchcraft had been a common pattern in New England, and there had been 1 or 2 accusations, arrests, or perhaps convictions. The number killed, that is 19, is comparatively small. Kluckern, for example, mentions that in 1884, amongst the Navajo, a chief brought about the execution of more than 40 witches. And where I do field work, that's an American example, but where I do field work in Far East Java, Indonesia, around 100 sorcerers were killed in the space of a few months in 1998. As with all cultural and social phenomena, we may analyse the events in many different ways. Boyer and Nissenbaum, 2 famous historians, depict a village divided into 2 factions, one identifying with agriculture and village ways, the other with mercantilism, that is merchant trading, and Salem town. The accusations, they argue, can be traced along the lines of these divisions. Herriman sees all witch hunts as attempts to deal with culture change. In particular, they are attempts to reduce systemic stress on society. Cultural disorganisation leading up to the Salem witch trials was related to the breakdown of control of the Puritans in the Massachusetts area. Puritans is one of the main Christian sects that developed out of the Reformation. It is characterised, according to Weber, by the exact opposite of the joy of living. Indeed, Puritans saw life in the world as a task. They lived to work rather than working to live. They rejected all signs of religious ceremony at the grave, and the Puritan would bury his nearest and dearest without song or ritual, in order that no superstition, no trust in the effect of magic and sacramental forces on salvation should creep in. They also rejected all sensuous and emotional elements in culture and in religion, because they are of no use and promote sentimental illusions and idolatrous superstitions. Rather than trusting in friends or other people, the Puritan quotes had exclusive trust in God. A Puritan hoped to have obtained God's favour, that is, to be in a state of grace in order to obtain eternal salvation. So, going back to Herriman now, he sees the cultural disorganisation leading up to the witch trials as part of the breakdown of the control of these people, these Puritans, in Massachusetts. Cultural disorganisation leading up to the Salem witch trials was related to the political, moral and philosophical breakdown of Puritan theocracy in Massachusetts. In particular, Puritans, according to Herriman, were losing their sense of community and purpose. Seen this way, the witch hunt in Salem was an implicit attempt by clergymen to reassert control without having forestalling a revolution or at least major change. For example, Cotton Mather, an influential minister who supported the trials, had previously published on witchcraft and possession. Okay, this might all sound confusing right now, but we will look into this theory in more detail later. The approach that we are most familiar with these days analyses witch hunts in relation to gender. One common take on witch hunts is that they target unruly women. However, historians tend to think this is not the case in Salem and surrounding villages. Carlson, for example, takes a more nuanced approach, arguing that witchcraft accusations were most often made against women who threatened the orderly transfer from father to son, that is, who threatened inheritance. In summary, the Salem witch trials occurred in colonial America and accounted for comparatively few victims, and they've been analysed in various different ways. Now we turn our gaze to events in the USA 360 years later. McCarthyism specifically refers to the attempt to uncover communists in America in the years 1950 to 1954. It is named after a US Senator, Joe McCarthy, who was the spearhead of the movement seeking out communist infiltrators. Communism, to people like McCarthy, was a mysterious but very real threat. Nevertheless, the sense of threat had a longer history. Indeed, instead of McCarthyism, some people referred to the 1950-54 period as the Second Red Scare. This followed a similar fear of communists in the First Red Scare, which had occurred in USA following the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. The Second Red Scare dates at least back to 1938, when the US House of Representatives had established a committee to investigate disloyalty and subversive activities among American citizens. The House Committee on Un-American Activities, as it was called, particularly focused on communists. It was famous for targeting, in 1947, a number of people suspected to be communists and involved in the film industry known as the Hollywood 10. This House Committee also pursued several communists in 1948 over espionage charges. Aside from this, the federal government had also established loyalty security reviews of government employees. The Red Scares and the government initiatives to counter communism were thus already in train when McCarthy arrived on the scene. The larger international context of McCarthyism was the post-World War II strategic situation, the rise of the Soviet Union, its atomic bomb, the spread of communism in Eastern Europe and the fall of the Iron Curtain, as it was known, and the victory of Mao's Communist Party in China, as well as the Korean War, all seem to indicate that a prolonged, worldwide, and possibly apocalyptic struggle against communism was at hand. Domestically, the Communist Party in the USA had been very large, with around 75,000 members around 1940. It thus appeared to many that Soviet-sympathizing communists were working for the Soviet enemy, planning to take control of the USA. Joe McCarthy became the voice of these concerns in the years 1950 to 54. It began with a speech made in 1950 in which he claimed to possess a list of communists working for the US State Department. These communists were pursued by the highest levels, and by this I mean the US Senate formed two subcommittees. One was the Subcommittee on the Investigation of Loyalty of State Department Employees, often simply called the Tidings Committee, after its chairman, Senator Millard Tidings. Although McCarthy testified to this Senate subcommittee, Senator Tidings eventually found McCarthy's claims of State Department employees working for the communists, he found these claims to be a big lie. Another subcommittee was formed by the Senate, but this was formed with a friend and supporter of McCarthy as chairman. Yet the hearings of this subcommittee too failed to prove the existence of card-carrying communists in the government. The FBI was also actively pursuing communists through this period, the most famous case being that of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. This husband and wife were tried and eventually executed in 1954 for passing secret information to the Soviets. However, this trial was undertaken in a normal or conventional court, criminal proceedings in a normal court, and not by one of these Senate subcommittees. So that is a brief overview of McCarthyism. I now want to talk about the play which connects, in most people's minds, McCarthyism with the Salem witch trials. I'm referring to here Arthur Miller's famous play, The Crucibles. Now, ostensibly this concerns the trials of accused witches in the Salem witch trial. However, it should be noted that the characters and events of the play correspond only loosely with the historical record. But it's not just issues of fact, but also of interpretation. Miller's characters are driven by vanity, greed, intolerance, competition for authority, and perhaps most of all, sexual desire. Academics, as we have seen, have focused on other issues, rightly or wrongly. Now, the first thing the guy on the street will tell you is that the playwright Miller uses the Salem witch trials as an allegory for McCarthyism. Indeed, the senatorial indictments of allegedly high-profile communists in 1950 to 1954 do bear some similarity with the persecution of the Great Witch Hunt and particularly the Salem witch trials. That said, the similarities are also limited. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, executed as spies in 1954, were almost certainly guilty of their crimes, and in any case were not tried by one of the committees formed by US Parliament. But can we say that the 19 hanged for witchcraft or for making an unlawful covenant with the devil in Salem were similarly guilty? Also in Miller's play, John Proctor, the character, scorns Abigail Williams. This leads to Proctor's wife being accused as a witch. Thus, sexual desire and vindictiveness play a large role in the Salem witch trials. It would be hard to maintain that sexual desire and vindictiveness played a similar role in McCarthyism. Therefore, it is probably a mistake to look for an accurate history of either the Salem witch trials or McCarthyism in the play The Crucible. And neither should we look for this. Like all historical dramas, it is more drama than academic history. Considering as we have the Great Witch Hunt, the Salem witch trials and McCarthyism, requires us to define witch hunts. Indeed, in all studies we need to define and narrow the object of study. So what I wish to study in this lecture series is cases in which there is firstly crisis. In other words, the backdrop will be social, political or economic crisis or turmoil which provides a sense of opportunity. As Cardozo notes, social, political, economic and religious upheaval makes society especially vulnerable to a craze. In an atmosphere of confusion and uncertainty, people become intolerant towards change. This seems to make sense, but it is hard to prove, so I will only state that crisis is important. We also need a sense of threat, wherein a myth is created about a diabolical threat to society. So we've got crisis, we've got threat. We also need scapegoating. Scapegoating occurs when a person or a group of people are blamed for this threat. So we're not talking about a meteor coming and crashing on Earth, but something that people are responsible for. So people are blamed for the threat. If we think about Nazi Germany, aside from the Jews, the November criminals, as they were called, the people who signed the Treaty of Versailles, were blamed by many Germans in the 1920s for the miseries of the fatherland. Cardozo notes that influential members of society single out and identify an enemy of the people, that is, the witch, the heretic, the communist, or the Jew. This infamous enemy is then blamed for all evil and uncertainty. Those accused or identified are seen as mere instances of a great threat. They may be seen as the cause for all society's wrongs. So that's the scapegoating aspect. Aside from this, we could say there's also a stereotype, a specific stereotype is applied to the victims. Firstly, they are typically imbued with extraordinary powers. As I have written elsewhere, among the Tiv of central Nigeria, for example, several movements arose to identify people who had attained power, or tsav, through cannibalism. One of these movements was called Yambua, or beef. One report described a guard kept over a corpse and then quotes, "There was a scare that a witch had come to eat the body. The guard pursued the supposed witch for some time. It turned into various shapes. It finished up as a goat on the edge of town." In China, during the Boxer Rebellion, rumours spread that Christians threatened the entire population. For fearful villagers, quotes, "Every bush or every tree appeared as the Christian Western enemy, against whom the Boxers, or the heavenly soldiers, offered supernatural protection." And this sense of persecution by the Christians helped the Boxers garner support. That's the first aspect of the stereotype. The second aspect, as already stated, is that the scapegoats are evil. They intend to do harm. So we've got crisis, threat, scapegoating, stereotyping. Another feature that I'm interested in is punishment. A person or group is subjected to what is considered punishment. The ostensible rationale is not so much retribution or restitution, but it is rather to prevent or limit the threat. We also need, and this is important, irrefutable charges. The charges have to be difficult or impossible to disprove for the accused. And if anybody is sceptical about the charges, they too risk being persecuted. And finally, I would say we need special procedures. That is, cases in which normal procedures are suspended or changed, and this is normally rationalised as being a result of the enormity of the threat. These kinds of cases I will call persecution. In other words, if we've got a crisis, a threat, scapegoating, stereotyping, punishment, irrefutable charges, and special procedures, then we can consider this, or we will analyse this as persecution. Now, within this larger category of persecution comes a smaller subcategory of witch hunt. And luckily this is easy. Basically, I'll just treat witch hunts as a kind of persecution in which the victims are believed to be witches or sorcerers. Now, not all punishment of witches and sorcerers would be persecution in the way I've defined it. For example, among the Azandi, ample opportunity is given to accused witches, like adulterers, to prove their innocence through oracles and through trials. Thus, formal procedures are employed to determine the guilt or innocence of a witch. So it's not an ad hoc approach, it's a long-established approach. So for the sake of analysis, that is because we need to limit this topic, I will not call the trial of a witch among the Azandi an example of a witch hunt or even persecution, just for the sake of analysis. Now, another thing we've got to discuss here is that often people use the term witch hunt to indicate that someone has been singled out or treated unfairly. On May the 30th, 2010, I did a Google search for witch hunt in the news section. The 10 results on the first page revealed no articles pertaining to practitioners of magic, but rather other matters. For example, in one, a lawyer for the Microsoft Corporation claimed his client, that is Microsoft, is the victim of a witch hunt, the corporation having been fined by the European Commission for abusing its market position. I did the same search on April the 26, 2012, and the term witch hunt was being used by a witness to describe the prosecution of somebody accused of child molestation. The author of an opinion piece claims that radical anti-environmental leaders are leading a witch hunt against the US president. The directors of a documentary state that 3 convicted murderers are the innocent victims of a witch hunt, and so on. In other contexts, the term witch hunt is also invoked by parents of cot death children being prosecuted for murder, by politicians standing on trial on criminal charges, and so on. Similarly, McCarthyism, the senatorial indictments of alleged high-profile communists, is often called a witch hunt. Those accused of misdeeds use the term witch hunt to imply that they are innocent, or that they did in fact undertake the actions which are construed as immoral or illegal, but the action should not be considered thus. Now, as anthropologists, if we use the term witch hunt in these broad ways, this would require us to distinguish what is entirely acceptable prosecution and morally unjust persecution. Every time someone felt they were innocent of the charges, or that the charges themselves were unjust, we would be forced to consider it a witch hunt. This would force us to make moral or evidential claims which we are in no position or in fact competence to make. We can't say whether, for example, the parents of cot death babies are or are not victims of a witch hunt. No doubt similar processes occur in some cases, but similar processes occur every time we gossip with colleagues about someone, and if we called the staff lounge or the work lounge the site of a daily witch hunt, we would render the term almost meaningless analytically, although the comparison might be metaphorically interesting. If the prosecution has elements which are reminiscent of a witch hunt, then we can draw attention to these elements. But all societies need to prosecute people who transgress the rules of the society. We cannot simply use the term witch hunt every time someone feels they are innocent. And all these phenomena, whether gossiping at the water cooler or cot death or McCarthyism or the European Commission and Microsoft, they're worthy of study, and it's fine to call such processes witch hunts in a non-academic or in a lay context. And indeed, it can be a powerful term to utilise in many political contexts, but it's not analytically useful here. In summary, in the Great Witch Hunt, in the Salem witch trials, and in McCarthyism, we see elements of persecution. However, I would refrain from using the word witch hunt to describe McCarthyism, the European Commission's prosecution of Microsoft, cot death parents, etc., because there is no allegation of magic use. Thus, we have so far looked at only 2 cases of witch hunts, and both in the West, the Great Witch Hunt and the Salem witch trials. But as we know, actions against accused witches and sorcerers have occurred in other contexts. Hutton's comparison of 100 anthropological studies throughout the world finds that some societies have feared and hunted witches with an intensity known only in the worst of the major European panics. Some such anthropological studies have provided details of outbreaks, although often in passing. And as Hutton notes, that the colonial witch persecutions of North America, like the Salem witch persecutions, were trivial affairs compared with those among native, we don't use that term anymore, but let's say indigenous peoples, as different and as widely dispersed as the Iroquois, Navajo, and the Tlingit. So, in other words, witch hunts have occurred throughout history in different parts of the world. And in the following lecture, I will consider anthropological accounts of witch hunts in Africa. I look forward to your company.